Honda is coming back to Formula 1. Sort of. No, we're not talking about Honda's sponsorship of the 2022 Japanese Grand Prix. We're talking about Honda's name finding its way back onto Formula 1 cars properly in 2023. If you think that sounds odd, don't worry, it gets odder. This isn't just a manufacturer that quit at the end of 2021, technically still being out of F1, but coming back in some way. It's all to do with the Red Bull-Porsche engine planned for 2026, and there's even speculation Honda could make a real comeback long term with its own works team. We're only halfway into the first season of Formula 1 since Honda officially left the championship, and it hasn't even done that very convincingly, given its engines are still being used by Red Bull and AlphaTauri and will be until the end of 2025. These carryover engines have continued to be assembled, maintained and updated by Honda, but run under the Red Bull powertrains name, with no Honda branding beyond a tiny HRC logo at the back of the engine cover. This is what's going to change for 2023 and give Honda a partial return to the F1 spotlight. Honda's strategy around Formula 1 has been odd throughout the hybrid era, only ever an engine supplier and often with minimal branding on the cars running its engines. But it reached a new peak with the deal that was done with Red Bull to continue to upgrade, maintain and supply power units that would never bear the Honda name. Now Red Bull's winning all these races and Honda's getting none of the credit. But that's going to partly change for next year, although exactly how much is still to be decided. It will come down to how prominent Honda wants to be in a championship it's not officially competing in, but in some way, shape or form, Honda will be more visible on the Red Bull next year. It could just be a significant amount more branding, perhaps the rear wing or engine cover, or Red Bull could even go as far as renaming the engine. Now you might be wondering why, if Honda didn't do this for 2022, why bother doing it for 2023 through to 2025, which is what this new arrangement will comprise in whatever form it takes. To help us get a clearer understanding of what's going on, here's our F1 reporter Scott Mitchell to explain.
The reason for this partial comeback is less to do with Honda's marketing strategy around Formula 1 and a lot more to do with Red Bull's future engine project with Porsche. Red Bull will be building its first ever Formula 1 engine for 2026 with Porsche, and to do that Red Bull wants to make sure it has access to all of the concessions that are going to be available to new power unit manufacturers, and this includes more dyno time and more money to spend. The problem is that per the original Honda continuation project plan, Red Bull was meant to run the engine from 2022 to 2025 under the Red Bull powertrains name, and from 2023 to 2025, Red Bull powertrains would be assembling and maintaining these engines. This clashed massively with the idea that Red Bull powertrains was a new engine manufacturer, because it would have had several years by 2026 of actually working and maintaining Formula 1 engines. Red Bull's solution has been pretty simple: try and put as much distance as possible between Red Bull powertrains and the Honda engine. And this has sort of come in two stages. First was at the start of this year, when Honda agreed to continue to maintain and supply the engines from Sakura in Japan permanently throughout this entire run to the end of 2025. Red Bull powertrains wouldn't take on this job at all. But linked to this is the fact that Red Bull never actually took over the intellectual property for the Honda engines. It just had permission to use them. IP transfer was going to be part of the initial plan, but this changed when Honda carried on doing the engines on its own in Japan, so Red Bull's never actually had access to this. Red Bull will hope that making the engines more obviously a Honda product again will reinforce the idea that Red Bull powertrains is nothing to do with it. Then its argument will be that the new company has no knowledge of existing F1 technology and no ability to update, maintain or assemble an F1 engine, at least before 2026. And this will underline the fact that Red Bull has no experience of being a Formula 1 engine constructor, exactly what it needs to guarantee those concessions for 2026.
We can't seriously call this a Honda comeback even if the company reappears on the entry list as the engine name, because it will still be an arm's length involvement. But for a while now there have been hints of Honda being open to the idea of a proper return with the new power unit rules in 2026. Working with Red Bull again for the new engine regulations is out of the question, as Red Bull will soon announce its Porsche partnership. So how could a full Honda return happen? F1 is quite keen on Honda coming back and has thought for some time that Honda may have come to regret its decision to leave. Before ex-managing director of Honda F1 Masashi Yamamoto left to join Red Bull Powertrains, we understand he suggested to Honda's CEO that if the company decided to return to F1 in the future, it would need to do so as a works team, not just an engine manufacturer. We've also been told that Sakura's F1 R&D work hasn't been switched off entirely, alongside its maintenance of the engines Red Bull and AlphaTauri are still using. Apparently, Honda has continued to keep an eye on the discussions for the 2026 technical regulations. That way, if a decision comes in the next couple of years to fire up the F1 program again, Honda will not be working from a standing start. One of the problems is that the F1 infrastructure Honda had outside of its Sakura R&D facility has been split up. Senior staff members now work in different departments, or like Yamamoto or the Honda staff in the UK HRD facility have joined Red Bull. We could also spend a long time dwelling on the fact Honda has no European base to work from, no immediate F1 team or chassis knowledge, and a very short and unsuccessful history as a works team. There has been a suggestion that Honda could potentially buy AlphaTauri and take over Red Bull's sister team, although this seems a long shot. For anything of substance to happen regarding a 2026 Honda F1 project, Honda's board would need to take a massive U-turn and commit serious investment. And there are clear reasons to doubt that would happen. Honda left because the board needed to redirect its enormous F1 research and development costs into other areas of the business as it has fallen behind rivals on sustainable technologies. It's also very unclear whether the current Honda board has any kind of strong connection to F1 anymore, let alone whether there's anything close to a consensus on what form a new program would take. Being an engine supplier is what has traditionally worked best, but even winning the World Championship wasn't enough to prolong that project because the short-term nature of Honda's F1 commitment has always been the manufacturer's undoing. If Honda decided to come back to F1 for a fifth era, then it would probably be well received by F1 and the FIA, which have shown the first hints of being willing to expand the grid beyond the current 10 teams. That hint of openness should also be good news for the likes of Michael Andretti, but the American's prospective F1 entry is being kept at arm's length. F1 stakeholders are demanding evidence of the benefits they would get from accepting an Andretti Global F1 team in 2024. In simple terms, Andretti needs to prove its F1 team would have the necessary resources to be a serious and long-term addition to the grid and generate enough commercial interest, primarily in the United States, to offset the money it would cost Liberty Media and or the other F1 teams by sharing the revenue with another entity. This logic is now well understood, although far from universally agreed with. There are plenty who think the Andretti name alone merits an F1 entry. Others are adamant that Andretti's got the right resources and partners. So why doesn't F1 share this view? The most likely reason we understand is that it does not want an extra team to be Andretti Global. Its preference is for it to be a new works entry like Honda. F1 would prefer a global manufacturer because it would have far greater reach and appeal internationally, whereas the Andretti argument has tended to be massively dependent on the theoretical benefits it would have in the United States. What seemed hypocritical about this is that Honda's always had a lack of long-term commitment to F1, whereas it's Andretti that isn't considered to be a stable enough prospect. If Andretti was thought likely to only last 5 or 6 years before pulling the plug, as history would tell us we could expect from a Honda team, its prospective entry would likely be dismissed almost immediately. So why even entertain the thought of another Honda project that gets canned after a few seasons of being underwhelming and expensive? The reason is pretty superficial. Even in the short term, Honda, or any manufacturer really, would probably be considered to have enough massive upsides for F1 that make it a worthwhile gamble no matter how vulnerable it is to boardroom changes of heart. Car manufacturers have always had a different allure to F1, and they've always, sooner or later, been tempted by the championship too. Just look at the Volkswagen Group, which is finally about to commit after decades of monitoring F1 from afar. That's why Honda would likely be above Andretti on F1's priority list, and why Honda doesn't seem capable of tearing itself away from F1 completely, even after quitting yet again.